Welcome to Plato's Pod Dialogues of Plato podcast. Today is February 14th, 2021. This podcast is audio recording of a live meetup group. We meet through Toronto Philosophy Meetup, Calgary Philosophy Meetup, Online Rebels Meetup. I am Eva Ellis. I will be coordinating this episode. And now I'd like to pass the screen and the microphone to James for today's discussion. James.
Well, thank you, Eva, and good morning, everyone. I'm James Myers. I am so happy to facilitate these discussions and so happy to share in some ideas and thoughts about Plato. And I think it's, as I keep saying, Plato, I think, is very accessible in that the works that he does are in the dialogue form. And I think it's really in the dialogue that we have ourselves on what Plato has written that we can actually derive some knowledge of our own. And so I learned things from these discussions, and I hope our participants learn things. It's great to see a number of our regular participants here, and always great to see new participants. So whether you're new to Plato or whether you've got an experienced background with Plato, I think we want to make this a welcoming place for everyone. As I said before, I kind of got really interested in Plato from the geometric angle. It was actually probably about 6 or 7 years ago that I was watching a television show, How the Universe Works, and they were talking about black holes. I just kind of started to think, well, how are these things possible? Nobody knows how these black holes work. And I got really interested in physics, and it was that interest in physics, I think, that kind of put me into geometry. And I think, today is maybe a chance where we can really kind of explore the geometric angles of Plato and this second half of the Timaeus that we're going to discuss today, that goes from 48a to the end. Kind of an exceptionally challenging, maybe, very different kind of piece of philosophy. And so I kind of just wanted to maybe start by I'll start with a question for everyone, but I think, as we put up in the meetup notice, what I thought would be helpful is, after we start with the opening question, maybe we'd do a review of what we discussed 2 weeks ago in the first half of the Timaeus, the part that goes up to 47e, because there's a particular train of logic there that I think may be very helpful in understanding the second part of the Timaeus. So I just thought, anybody who speaks, please feel free to share your experience and thoughts on Plato with us. And also, I should just say that there's a Q&A window in the chat window that you can use. I'm not able to really follow those in detail as I'm facilitating the discussion, just because I'm focusing so much on the comments that people are making. But Eva does monitor them, and if anybody sees anything in those chats that are of interest and you want to bring it forward to the group as a whole, please feel free to speak up and raise those issues with your voice. So that's good. And then we'll do as we have in the past, and I think it works fairly well, is use the raise hands feature in Zoom to, if you'd like to make a point, and I'll call on participants kind of in the order that the hands are raised, but I'll give preference to those who haven't spoken before first. So looking forward to your comments. So I just thought, as I said, I'd kick off with a question, and then we'll go and maybe just do a review of the first part of the Timaeus that we did 2 weeks ago. And so the opening question is, we're looking now at the section 48a to the end. Is this philosophy, or is this logic, or is this both? And perhaps maybe one of the most famous parts of aspects of this section of the Timaeus is Plato's definition of the 5 regular solids. So the 5 geometric shapes that are the only regular 5 geometric shapes in the universe. And I think this has had particular importance for the scientific community. But, other than that, what do you think of this part of the dialogue? And it's really a monologue at this point. What do you think of this? Is this philosophy? Is it logic? Is it both, or is it neither? I just throw the question out there generally. What do people think? What struck you in this part of the Timaeus? Is there anything that struck you as particularly interesting or particularly odd? So I just put the question out there. What do you think? What does everybody think? Any particular thoughts on this first part? It seems that Plato here is spending some time talking about physics. And certainly, the way that we divided our discussion In the first part 2 weeks ago, we looked at the creation of the intelligent part of the universe. So that part of the universe that accommodates observers such as us. And in this part, from 48a to the end, Plato is looking at the creation of the physical universe. So not the part of the observer that we looked at last time, but the part that is observed. And it seems that, it seems somewhat logical maybe that the two parts should be distinct from one another, right? So just wondering what you think of the observable part of the universe that he's describing in 48a to the end. So he starts with really some parts of physics, and then he gets into physiology near the end. He talks about the creation of the human body and the organs and all of that. So it seems very unusual. Has anybody encountered anything like this in a philosophical discussion? Are there any precedents for this? Have any other philosophers sort of taken this line of thinking or reasoning? Oh, sure, Gregory, go ahead.
Okay, I'm a scientist by training, so I sort of felt this is a bit more at home with me than the rest of other stuff. And I have recently kind of reviewed, the pre-Socrates kind of philosophical line of thinking, starting from searching for the universal origin, the origin for the universe and other stuff. So I felt this is sort of capturing or summarization of what they know or what Plato know, and not necessarily, and the way to put it is not necessarily what Plato think or what Plato discover. It really is he's using other people's mouths to summarize what is the state of understanding about the universe, because the Greek started looking for understanding of the universe, starting with the mythology. The mythology really is their original understanding of the universe. And the early philosophers come along, say, hey, this has nothing to do with the gods. And really is, the nature display itself. They start to describe and understand these things with, a lot of imaginations and postulate and speculate on that. And whenever that they really feel challenging in a reasonable explanation, they will go back to gods. Gods think this way. So they didn't really do away with the gods. And at the end of the day, the interesting thing here is that at some point, this one god come along. I mean, the mythology was a family or society of gods. They collectively do all these things, but now you have a single god. So, but anyway, I felt this was a kind of capturing of the understanding at the time. Mm-hmm. And while, kind of introduce a few kind of ideas of his own into it. But anyway, that's my kind of immediate response.
Well, thank you. Yes, and as I was reading this, it just seemed to me that the explanations that Plato is bringing forward, both in physics and in physiology at the end, they actually seem plausible. I mean, according to what I know about physics, I'm not a trained philosopher. I'm not a trained physicist. It's all done through self-learning. But what I know, I mean, I can't see anything that's really a leap of logic, anything that's really outside the realms or boundaries of logic in this. And so I just wanted to put that out there. It just seems to me kind of a logical account of how the physical universe might be constructed.
I can make some comment on that. And I actually recently just thinking things in this line and read a lot of pre-Socrates material as well as Aristotle's material. Logic wasn't really mature at the Plato's time. It was Aristotle who picked up all the elements that are raised by Plato in his dialogues, and then systematically organize and then put forward a theory of logic. And from there on, I would say there's truly a logical thinking. But at Plato, it was a combination of dialectic reasoning and then some kind of a logical reasoning, but they don't quite figure it out including, they even have problems still with definition, but they still wanted to put forward a picture or understanding of the universe from forming information of a star to the behavior of a human psychological thing. So I think it's marvelous. I look at this, I say, gosh, the amount of knowledge that it's. I mean, I read also. Okay, I'm talking about the rest of the dialogue, which you talk about the human behavior, disease, medicine, all that, and it's really incredible that the body of knowledge that I think collectively at the time people know, and which I'm a scientist, and I think has a lot of scientific flavor. The attitude is scientific. The content is, in today's understanding, are all wrong. But nevertheless, the spirit is there. They put forward this thing oftentimes as probably, likely, and it's very tentative. They're not taking this as absolute knowledge or even correct knowledge. So the modesty it really reflects the kind of philosophical attitude or scientific attitude. And the science was really at its very infancy at that point in time. The word science really started to split from the word knowledge about that time. Before it was just mental knowledge. But starting from Plato, the science as an art of searching knowledge start to appear. I find that's very interesting.
Well, thank you. I mean, and certainly what you say about knowledge is very central to Plato's whole thesis. And we started looking at his idea of knowledge in our very first dialogue that we looked at back in I think it was late summer. We talked about the Meno, and knowledge is the account of the reasons why, and knowledge is recollection, which is a theme that keeps coming up in Plato's dialogues. And so, knowledge is something that's continuously derived. And so let's look at what you were saying, Greg, in terms of, whether this is plausible or not. It's certainly a good lead in to the first half that I was hoping we could review. And I thought maybe this is a good point to do that. I've got Joel with his hand raised, and I don't know if JK, whether you had your hand raised earlier or not, but if you feel like jumping in. Joel, would you like to say something or no? Okay. All right. Or JK, did you have anything to say? No? Okay. Well, why don't we, this would be a good time, I think, maybe just to take a look at the first half. So Eva, if you could put up that slide, the review slide that I prepared. This is posted on the shared drive. And this is meant to really just review what I saw as the logical flow in the first half of the Timaeus, and starting with 28a. And we can go as quickly or as slowly as everyone participating would like with this. But I just thought it would be useful to get these ideas out, starting with this very first point in 28a, because there's a particular logical flow that goes from 28a to 32b, which I think is interesting and will help us maybe to understand the second part, maybe with kind of a richer context. So at 28a, Plato says, or through the character Timaeus, says that we need to make at the outset a distinction between two states of existence and the way we comprehend or our knowledge of those two states of existence. So the first state is that which always is and has no becoming. And there I've underlined the word is, because I think that's something that we maybe should discuss and understand what is meant by the word is. So the first state is that which always is and has no becoming. And the word becoming, there's a footnote in the text that I'm using, in the translation that I'm using, that ties that to the Greek word genesis. And the character Timaeus says that this state is comprehended by a reasoned account. So our knowledge of this state, we have to use a reasoned account to understand this state of being. So that state which always is and has no becoming. So it never changes. It's unchanging. And then the second distinction is, or the second state, is that which becomes but never is. So we've got a different word here, becomes. So the first state is that which is. The second state is that which becomes. And the second state is comprehended by sense perception, which is unreasoning. So we have different ways of deriving knowledge. The first state, we derive our knowledge with a reasoned account. And the second state, we derive our knowledge by using our senses. And our senses themselves don't reason. It's our brain that reasons, right? So I thought this was an interesting place to start with in terms of the logical flow of the construction of the first part of the Timaeus. And again, that's the part where Plato describes how intelligence is embedded in the universe. And from there, and if anybody feels like jumping in with a question or a comment anytime, feel free to do that. I'll watch for the hands being raised here. The second part of the logical flow, I think, is also in 28a. So this is in the second paragraph in the slide here. And that's where Timaeus says that which becomes, so he's talking now about the second state of existence, that which becomes requires a cause. And I've underlined the word there. So requires a cause for its genesis. And it says, it is impossible for anything to come to be without agency of cause, which is the reason why. So we have this state of becoming, and the cause is the reason why it has become the way it has. And think back about the first, paragraph, the one that we looked at just above, that the state that always is and never becomes requires a reason to count to understand it. So this is a particularly important, I think, part in the logical flow. This initial distinction that we make between two states of existence and the way that our knowledge is derived of those two states. And then the logical flow, I think, next goes to paragraph 3 here, which is at 29e. And Joel, I see your hand up. I'll just make this point, and then we'll go to you, Joel. So the third point is the reason why the universe of becoming. So again, this is the second state of being, was framed by the framers or craftsman's goodness. One who is good can never become jealous of anything. And then I just put in square brackets just my understanding of jealousy as being desire for that which one does not have, and the framer being all that is, has no need for anything else. So far we've got 3 steps in the logical process, and I've got 2 hands up. So we'll take Joel Schuster first, and then Joel Garland second. Joel Schuster.
Thank you very much, James. You've gone through 3 steps, and I must confess that I am lost at the first step. And here's the nature of my confusion. So 28a, at the outset, distinction is made between 2 states of existence and comprehension. So I'm trying to visualize this in a kind of a chart of some sort. So are we really talking about 2 states for each of existence and comprehension? And therefore we're talking about a matrix of 4? Or is it just 2 that we're talking about? So maybe that was clear to everyone else, or maybe I'm just so picayune that nothing could satisfy me. But I wonder if anybody else has any queries about that.
Interesting question, especially when you think that a state of existence often has a beginning and an end. So each state would require kind of 2 points in it, beginning and an end. So if there's 2 states, then maybe there is a total of 4 points of comprehension, especially when we get time into the picture. I think might be a good question. But so it's a good question, Joel. Thank you. And if anybody else has any thoughts on that one, it would be good to understand. But I think overall the idea here, at least my understanding of the idea, is that there is the universe itself, which I think Plato is saying always is never in a state of becoming, because it just is the sum total of everything that exists. And then there is within it the state of becoming. And that state of becoming is constant and never reaches an end. And so the state of becoming never is. Is kind of like an end state. That's the way I'm understanding it. But anybody else who has thoughts on that, please do let us know. And then the other Joel. Joel?
Yes, please. My question was exactly the same as the other Joel on 28A. I just wanted some clarification on the second sentence that saying that it's impossible for anything to come to be without agency of cause, which is the reason why. So could I get just clarification on what exactly is agency? And is that discounting the existence of like an infinite or eternity, for example?
Mm-hmm. Well, good question. I mean, I think agency is the source of the cause. That would be my understanding of the word. And here I'm actually thinking, there's a little bit of physics here, and I think I'm seeing in this other part of 28A, Joel has just referred to the second paragraph here on the slide on the screen, in talking about the cause of coming to be or becoming. And in this, I'm actually seeing Newton's first law of motion. Newton's first law of motion basically says nothing happens unless there's a force applied to cause it to happen. And certainly that's a universal physical law. And here in this part of the Timaeus, we're talking about physics. So I think it's, what the point that Plato's making here is that something doesn't become unless a force is acted on it and causes it to come to be. So anybody else who has any thoughts on that, by all means, let us know. So these are two. I think these are two really key starting points to the understanding of what Plato is trying to say in the Timaeus. So we've got these two states of existence. We've got a cause for the state of becoming. We've got the reason why being goodness. And before I go on to the fourth point, I've got JK. JK?
Yeah, when you talk about cause, if the is always, is, then that would be the cause, right? Cause of itself, right?
Right.
But then he's also positing that there is a becoming.
Right.
Becoming is never is, but what is the cause of the becoming? Mm-hmm. Is that the is? So how do you know which one came first, the is or the becoming? I mean, it doesn't. It's kind of separating the two ideas that the which one is the cause of itself or cause of everything. He's saying he's kind of like privileging is as the cause, right? But then how do you get becoming if that's the case? And so it's just like Parmenides saying that there is no change at all. It's an illusion, right? There's only is. And he's denying what Heraclitus is saying, that there is only becoming. The becoming is the cause of what is. And is never just is. It's always also part of the becoming.
Sorry, I couldn't see the raised hand in my side. I just felt that, could that necessity be an agent? In the way I read, it seems the necessity is before universe. It has always been there. And or could that be also God? It seems a necessity God exists already at the same time, along with the four elements.
Right. Well, the question is necessity is, which always is, right? And you could say that's God, but is necessity becoming? That could be also. That also could be. You could say that could be the being, right? That could be the cause of everything.
Yeah.
So you can't really. It doesn't make sense for him to for one to privilege is, right? So because that's how Parmenides was the one who posited that, and his student was Zeno, who came up with these paradoxes that don't really make sense. You get caught in this reasoning of paradox, and it doesn't come out. It doesn't make sense. It denies your empirical experience. You can see that what's there, and science is based on empirical knowledge too, right? not just reasoning.
You raised, it's a very good question, JK, and I think it really relates to, perhaps in part, to our understanding of the words is and becoming. And I think we need to explore maybe the definitions of those words. Certainly I think it's a very important question in logic, is the meaning of those two words. As I said, I think I see the state of is as kind of an eternal, unchanging state. That's the end, the final state. There is no more becoming once you reach is. It's like you start at a certain point, you go out as far as you can, and that's what is.
Right.
Like there's nothing beyond that. And I think, as the train of logic goes down further down this page, we haven't got there yet, but Plato's makes the point that there is only one universe.
Right.
And so that is, I think, kind of like the final, where there is nothing else. That's the way I see it. But I just wanted to go to Jane, who has her hand up. And Jane, what would you like to say?
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hi. Sorry. So I just wanted to share my interpretation of how I understood the is and becoming. So when I was reading throughout the dialogue, I would sort of find these, I guess, like opposite definitions that seem to be one referring to like being and the other one to becoming. So, for example, I noticed that there was, for example, the pair of eternal and changing. So for me, being is the eternal part and changing is becoming, and that makes sense. And when they were discussing the creation of the universe, how I understood it is that the eternal being is what created a sort of copy or imitation of itself, which became the changing, the becoming. And this sort of made sense to me because later on, when the sort of creation of time was discussed, I wrote this out: eternal image moving according to number. This image is called time. So sort of the changing, the becoming is something that is just an imitation of the eternal, of the being. And we see that sort of in the perception of time, where we're given something that is eternal, that is a sort of image. So the sort of becoming or changing, that is moving according to numbers, and that is what we perceive as time. And some of the other things that I've linked to being and becoming is that being is reason, it's intelligence, it's truth, it's something that is undividable. And the changing, the becoming, it is sense, opinion, belief, the dividable, something that could be divided into different separate parts. I don't know how much this makes sense, but this is sort of how I interpreted it.
Well, thank you, Jane. I think you really hit on a number of very key points, and the words you used, I think, are very important. This idea, this state of is maybe being the state that is not divisible. It cannot be further distributed because it is the sum total of everything. And meanwhile, we've got this state of becoming, which is the physical state, which is the state that's always changing, right? And it is not a permanent state. It's always subject to change. And you mentioned time. I mean, time, consists of past, present, and future, but the present is the state of what Plato calls elsewhere. I don't think he uses the term in this dialogue, but he calls elsewhere the state of coming to be in the present. So the present is the kind of the undefined state that is always subject to change. And we need that. We don't want to be stuck in a static universe. The present is our dynamic potential. The present is the state that's always coming to be. This is the point in time, that kind of middle point in time, where we have the ability to be agents, the ability to cause things to happen. And so I really like the way you put that, Jane. So yeah, just wondering what others think about this. I have Wayne and then Alex. Wayne?
Yes. Full disclosure, I've been cheating a bit. I've been using a book by Cornford, Plato's Cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
And in regard to this, I hope this is on the right area. I'm just going to quote from a section that I think applies to this. It is true that in such becoming, something new is always appearing, something old passing away. But the process itself can be conceived as going on perpetually without beginning or end. For this perpetual becoming, the sort of cause needed is not a cause that will start the process at some moment and complete it at another, but a cause that can sustain the process and keep it going endlessly.
Well, thank you, Wayne. And actually, that idea of something that has no beginning and no end may be very helpful to understanding the nature of the first state of existence that's spelled out in 28a, that state that always is and has no becoming. And as we're going to get into some geometry, I think today, that which has no beginning and no end, there's one particular geometric figure that kind of strikes me as relevant to that, and that would be the circle. And certainly Plato makes the point in the beginning part of the Timaeus about circles and spheres. So thank you. I think that which has no beginning and no end, I think, is very helpful to understanding that first state of existence. Alex, and then JK. Alex?
Yeah, thanks, James. Thanks for the meeting. Hi, everybody. Just a quick point, I guess, echoing what previous couple of speakers have said about these two opposites, being and becoming. So one reading of Plato that I like, it kind of makes sense, though it may be, people could disagree with it, I guess, but it's sort of kind of a standard reading, I guess, that Plato, in a way, brings together Parmenides and Heraclitus. And so, he sees, I guess, those two as kind of extremes, Heraclitus being mostly about becoming, Parmenides being mostly about being. And I think what Plato wants to do is take both of those principles, but definitely put them in a hierarchy, right? So being is definitely higher than becoming. And I think as the quote the previous speaker read said, being, sets becoming into a kind of eternal motion, or perpetually kind of sustains the becoming of the physical world. And so there's a kind of synthetic or a kind of synthesis, I guess, that Plato is creating here. So I think that's an interesting way of reading it, because I guess maybe he saw himself as correcting the mistakes of those earlier philosophers, because they were so kind of one-sided in a way. And it's what's amazing about Plato is how many different things show up in his philosophy, right? It's not just one idea, but it's such a mixture of perspectives.
Well, thank you, Alex, and certainly I like that idea of synthesis. And I think what you said kind of goes back to what Joel G said earlier. Is the state, or maybe the question that Joel G asked earlier, which is is that state of is, the unchanging state of is it the cause of everything? And that's something I think that we can explore. So I've got a few speakers. I've got JK, and then Joel G, and then Jane. JK?
Yeah, I think it's it's I agree with what Alex said, but the idea of the hierarchy, and you could see that the hierarchy of being, you could see that in his political writings and social philosophy. So he's kind of like, emphasizing the importance of the is, and the becoming becomes an illusion. So that's where he gets this hierarchy, that the things in the world of becoming is really just an imitation, a replica of the forms, right? The forms of the being. And so he's emphasizing the is, and he's also, of course, he's bringing in Heraclitus, but the ideas of that comes from Heraclitus is sort of demoted to this the material world, as if that really, is not as real as the is of the forms. So you can, so, and this circle of this idea of the circle could be also a whether true or not, for people, for rationalists who create these circles of eternal being, is their creation out of their out of their reasoning, their it's the power of reason to create these kind of their notions of what is being, what is real, and that I guess after Plato that continue on, and probably like I guess Parmenides would be the first that did that. I guess I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And yeah, I mean, definitely, you use the word hierarchy, which I struck a chord in me. To this state of this eternal state would seem to be the first order in the hierarchy, and then becoming is what comes next. So I like that idea. Joel G.
Yes, please. So something that I would like to be corrected on if I'm mistaken here, but the entire impression I'm getting from 28A all the way down to 31A is a sense that both the universe and nature as a whole is in some sense rational and intelligible, created by this what's called as a craftsman. So my question is, where does what James, you're fond of saying a lot, is where does the uncertainty principle come in, or chaos theory come into play? This idea of randomness, so to speak, that can break apart and create inertia or just decay through all of that. Is there any sense of just sort of this random chaos that plays a part in this as a whole? So where does that fit in this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joel. And certainly, I think I don't think we would want to live in a universe that's static, because then we wouldn't have any agency, or we wouldn't able to cause anything. So, there's a well-established principle of physics, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that says that that there is uncertainty in the universe. And as troubling as uncertainty can be to us and to philosophers and to scientists, it's perhaps a very fortunate thing for us that there is, because when there's uncertainty, we're able to cause things to become. And so I thought I like the question. And I think again, if we look at geometry and we think about the second part of the Timaeus that we've read today, and I think it's important to look at the first half in this logical flow, but maybe I'll start to tie some comments into the second half. In terms of geometry, there is certainty in the rational parts, or the rational proportions. And Plato makes the point that everything is proportion. But then there's what we call irrational, or what I think the ancient Greeks called incommensurable. And in the incommensurable portions, there is no certainty. There is no finality in the incommensurable, in the mathematics and the geometry of incommensurability. And so this point about proportion, I think, is very important. And then Jane reminded us that time, in Plato's words in the first half, is an eternal image moving according to number. And so numbers can be rational and they can be irrational, commensurable or incommensurable. And so that's how I would see it. But I think we can certainly take others' impressions. And so I will move to Jane with that. Jane?
This may be a little bit off topic at this point, but I'm just wondering if anyone saw a sort of like, in the terms of being and becoming, if anyone saw like the sort of preconception of the later on idealism and materialism and philosophy. Hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, because at one point I think I saw that there was a line being drawn in the dialogue of the eternal or the being something non-matter, and the changing and becoming being something that is matter. So I'm just wondering if anyone had similar impressions.
Thanks. It's a good question, and it may relate to this idea of the distinction, which I think was drawn particularly in the Phaedo, which we discussed. I think that was back in November or December, of the contrast between the visible universe, which is really, I think, the physical universe, and the invisible universe. And I think maybe by the end of our session today, we might get to that. And so certainly a good question to ask Jane. And if anybody has any thoughts on that, by all means. So I just wanted to move forward with the logical flow here and maybe just go to the fourth point. And so this is where we're now at 30A in the first half that we looked at 2 weeks ago. And the point is made that wanting everything to be good and nothing to be bad, so far as that was possible, the framer brought all that was visible, and I put in square brackets my understanding to be that which is in physical existence, from a state of discordant and disorderly motion into a state of order, for the reason that order is in every way a greater degree of good than disorder. And so it's tying this idea of goodness and order together. And order maybe might help to answer or provide some insight into Joel G's question about certainty versus uncertainty. And so where there's uncertainty, perhaps order is something that really helps us to understand, at least to set our paths according to some sort of order, rather than chaos. I think chaos is the word that you use, Joel, and I think, certainly none of us likes chaos. Chaos is a little bit stressful, and so to the extent that there was order created in the universe, I kind of like that connection to what you said. And then we go on to the fifth point, which I saw in the logical flow, which is at 30B. So in the naturally visible, in square brackets again, physical realm, things that possess intelligence as a whole must always be better than things that are unintelligent as a whole, which is actually good for us, I think, right? Therefore, it is impossible for anything to possess intelligence apart from the square bracket invisible soul. So here's where we bring in the idea of soul, the only domain of intelligence. Intelligence, being invisible, was put in soul, and soul was put in body, being visible. So, and we've talked about this before, I think this idea that each one of us is really a combination of visible and invisible. So when I look in the mirror, I see the visible me, kind of odd looking, I've got body, head, limbs, I know that there's the visible part of me, but the invisible part of me is that which animates me, or, maybe what Plato called the soul. And that I can't see in the mirror. That only comes to me in my comprehension or sense of meaning, and that's the invisible part. So I think this is a pretty powerful piece of logic here in number 5 here at 30B. This idea of intelligence being kind of the paramount concern, I think, or the realm of meaning in the universe. And then we to the sixth point in the logical flow, I think, is at 30C, and this is where the point is made that beauty is likeness to that which is complete. And so the word here, complete, and the word beauty, I think, are tied together. And again, just to bring it back to that point about jealousy, and this, I think, is the framer being all that is and having no need for anything else, wasn't jealous. And the universe comprising beauty resembles more closely than anything else that single intelligent living thing, again with that capital L, capital T that we talked about 2 weeks ago, which comprehends within itself all intelligent living things. So the universe itself is a capital L, capital T living thing. And then we are among the intelligent living things within that single living thing. So that's the sixth point in the logical flow. And then the seventh point I saw at 31A, there is but one universe, which is not a container of separate parts, but rather is an integrated whole in its own derivative. And, I see in this, and I put in square brackets, that intelligent thereby persists in a continuum. And, again, I think that's maybe something that's good for us as intelligent beings, is that there is this continuity of intelligence. Intelligence never breaks in this concept. And then just to kind of end our review of the first part of the Timaeus at 31C to 32B, there being but one living thing that requires a physical form for its state of becoming. And again, we go back to that distinction that's made at 28A, that, the distinction between the state that always is and never becomes and the state that becomes but never is, consisting in the invisible soul and the visible body. There must be some bond of unity between visible and invisible. And so then there's a few subpoints made here. Eva, if you could just scroll down just a little bit on the screen here. The first point is that the best bond is one that really and truly makes a unity of itself together with the things bonded by it. And this is in the nature of things best accomplished by proportion. And so there's that word proportion being ratio. I know some people last time in the chat window were talking about the golden ratio, which maybe we'll have a chance to explore because that's a mathematical and geometric concept. The second subpoint here, the bond itself is a third element between the two things that it unites. And then I just put in square brackets, in proportion with which the bond is best accomplished is both mathematical and geometric in its nature. And then lastly, or not lastly, but nearly lastly, so there's this quote, so if the body of the universe were to have come to be as a two-dimensional plane, interesting that Plato uses that word, two-dimensional plane, a single middle term would have sufficed to bind together its conjoining terms with itself. As it was, however, the universe was to be a solid, and the footnote in my translation says solid is a cubic, or a cube structure, and solids are never joined together by just one middle term, but always by two. And that brings to mind the Euclidean axiom to me, things that are like one thing are like each other. And the real trick is to get that to happen in 3 dimensions. So very interesting here, and I just say this as somebody who has spent a lot of time with geometry. Very interesting here that Plato would talk about two-dimensional planes. Certainly Euclid was, I think at the time, obviously very well known for his two-dimensional geometry and axioms. But Plato, I think, was all about taking that into 3 dimensions. Had a very interesting discussion with somebody recently, of a scholarly background who thought that Plato's geometry was really no more than what a high school student now would know. And I'm not so sure about that. I think Plato was, very keenly a geometer. In fact, that sign above the door of his academy, let no one who is bereft of geometry enter these doors, was a very key thing. And so I think it's very important to understand the place of geometry in Plato's philosophy. And maybe that's where we kind of move into a more in-depth discussion of the second part of the Timaeus, is just kind of, and I'll put the question out there, what is the role of geometry in philosophy? Is its role in logic, and therefore is the role of logic to inform philosophy? And so maybe I just put that out there. But if anybody has any questions on this particular slide before we leave it, I just wanted to make sure again that we understood kind of the logical flow that leads to this second half of the time that we're looking at today. Joel.
Yes, please. I very much want to just piggyback off of what you said quickly about how you came across that observation on whether or not Plato knew a little more, a little less than grade 12 geometry. I came across that too not too long ago, and for the most part, I just want to acknowledge, like, that still to me is so incredibly impressive, especially just going back barely 300 years ago, where the majority of people around the world were illiterate. So if you it's grade 12 geometry is not easy. So like, that's still incredibly impressive in my books, especially if you want to take it like a couple thousand years ago. No calculators, no telescopes, no microscopes. So, and I'm still blown away by that regardless. So that's just a quick shout out for Plato.
Well, thank you. And certainly, I guess maybe there's an assumption, maybe this person I was speaking to assumed that knowledge is always now greater than it has always been in the past. And I think that's a natural assumption, because we think that we learn new things each day. So we think that knowledge is always adding to that which existed before. And so knowledge is always increasing. I guess it's kind of maybe a natural assumption that we make, but it's actually a point that Plato makes at the beginning of the Timaeus with his story about Atlantis and his story about the destruction of civilizations. So if you remember our discussion 2 weeks ago, at the beginning of the Timaeus, Plato talks about how there have been these planet-destroying events through history. And he talks specifically about fires and floods. And we know now that there was an asteroid strike just off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula that, it's pretty widely accepted, wiped out the dinosaurs. It caused a planetary-wide fire that destroyed every living thing on this planet, pretty much every living thing on this planet. And we know that there was a flood, and we know that there was an ice age. And Plato makes reference to fires and floods and the destruction of knowledge and the destruction of memory right at the beginning of the Timaeus. And I think that ties to his story of Atlantis, the very famous story of Atlantis at the beginning. And so, this is an important question. Does knowledge always increase in a straight line, and is it never broken, or do these events sometimes happen that break knowledge? And so I just kind of wonder whether there was some knowledge of geometry and other things back then that has been lost over the ages from events like these planet-wide destruction events, or like the Dark Ages, all of these things where knowledge gets lost or used in different ways. It's a very important thing to understand the nature of knowledge, I think. And so, it's I think, where I wanted to start, I think the second half is to understand the nature of logic and the idea of shape. So, I had an argument with somebody. It didn't start off being an argument. It became an argument, quite heated actually. And this person who had studied logic was adamant that there are multiple systems of logic, and the systems don't need to tie together. And I, being naive and not really trained in these things, I just naturally seemed to me that there should be one system of logic to which all systems of logic eventually have to boil down to, eventually have to relate to. And a single, and I guess maybe it's getting to this idea that Plato's talking here about there's one universe. If there's one universe, does there have to be one system of logic? And maybe I'll just put that question out there in terms of the second half of the Timaeus. Do we see that, that this universe that's being constructed, the physical universe, the observable universe in the second half of the Timaeus, starting at 488a, is it a single system of logic that Plato is describing here? Or are there multiple systems of logic? For example, Plato talks about the physics of the components of earth, water, air, and fire. And then he talks about physiology. He talks about the actual construction of the human body. Are these, is the construction of the human body, for example, working with one system of logic, which is different from the physics of earth and water and air? And is that different from the logic that governs the intelligence that's embedded in the universe in the first part of the Timaeus? I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts on whether there is one single system of logic in the universe or multiple systems of logic in the universe. And I don't know if that question relates to the nature of reasoning itself. Maybe it's that I tend to approach things from an inductive reasoning approach, where I'm looking, again, being naive and not trained in these things, I'm looking at the end result and I'm working my way back to what would have been the beginning. And maybe that's kind of, in my understanding, that could be like the account of the reasons why. When you start with the end and you work your way back to the why that really existed at the beginning. And maybe this person I was arguing with was taking a deductive approach, starting at, what was supposed to be the first principle and then deducing the outcomes from that first principle. But I think the problem maybe goes back to 28a in the Timaeus, where Plato's saying that which is, you cannot find the first principle of that because it always is. There is no becoming in that. And you need that reasoned account to find your way back to that point. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because I think, the second half of the Timaeus is one that's very much related to logic. And, I think logic to me is a single thing, but I don't know. As I said, I'm not trained in these things. And I just wonder what people's perceptions of logic are. JK, what your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure about the logic. I just wanted to, see if I'm on the right track of understanding what logic is. Is there, like you mentioned, the inductive and deductive logic? Is that different from mathematical logic? When you do mathematics, are you using a different kind of logic, or is similar to inductive and deductive? And also, Aristotle's logic of A equals A, that kind of, non-contradiction logic, the principle of the excluded middle. Are there, is there a logic that's different from the non-contradictory principle of logic?
Mm-hmm.
Some later philosophers, I think, say that there is. Russell's idea of the paradoxes that he comes up with, in logic. Are those? Is that a separate kind of logic?
Mm-hmm. Good questions. I certainly in mathematics, I think it would seem to be non-contradiction is required in that context. But you raise a question of the excluded middle, which I think is very important to understand in the context of, both Plato and Aristotle, and maybe their differences in approach. To me, just again, being naive, but just based on the definition of the word, logic can't contradict itself. I mean, that would seem to be a requirement. And so in the construction of the universe, if the universe is a logical thing, and the logic of the universe includes intelligence, which operates with uncertainty, but it also includes the certainty of physics, then somehow the logic would need to tie together this uncertainty of intelligence and certainty of physics, the uncertainty of the invisible and the certainty of the visible. And I think that's an important point. So thank you for that question. Let's see what others think. Jane and then Alex. Jane?
James, I really liked what you just talked about, and I've been thinking about it for a very long time. I haven't all my studies go back to soft sciences. That's why I think I'm a little kind. It's kind of difficult for me to handle the more hardcore logic type of things. So math and physics are definitely not my strong points. I have very, very very bad knowledge of them. But I always ask that same question: is there one sort of unifying logic that exists? Because formal logic definitely it definitely doesn't help in a lot of things in life and in specific sciences. But I found that there's a little bit of sort of closure in dialectics where sort of the logic of things means that you have something where you have one part A and then you have one part B, and the B is contradicting to the A, but there is this tie-in element of C that makes it all fit together. So sort of everything that we have in our life consists of things that contradict each other. And like it's kind of really hard for me to word because this is a very raw thought that I've been having. Like the idea of time that's in this dialogue of where you have eternity, and the way that I saw it, it put in a very rough way, is that becoming is sort of like eternity being stretched out, and we're just getting these snapshots of eternity, and that is what is becoming, and that is what we see, and that is what we work with. But there's this like long stretching eternity that has no beginning or ending, and there's no way that we can get all of its snapshots. And that's why sort of we're looking at things and we're making sense in one field or another field, but when we try to make like the big picture fit together, it's not working out. And I don't think, at least to me, like on my very novice and unknowing level, it feels like things are not fitting in, not because there is no greater logic, but we just don't know it, or we don't have those snapshots to make it all fit together, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Jane, you spoke beautifully there. I think that, this idea of these snapshots and what you said earlier, using Plato's quote of time being a moving image of eternity, I think is so key. And actually, as you were saying that, there was an image that came to my mind, and I, being kind of like novice, like you said, you are. I mean, I'm a novice too in these things. I'm not a trained mathematician or geometer. It's just what I've, logic that I've used over the years to arrive at these points. As you were talking about these snapshots, I was getting this picture in my mind, and I tend to think in pictures because it helps. I was getting this picture in my mind of a circle that's opening and closing and opening and closing. And as that circle broadens, our knowledge increases. As it narrows, our knowledge decreases, our focus increases. You also mentioned, this idea of contradictions, because, Plato talks a lot, not just in this dialogue, but in other dialogues about opposites. And I've got a little, image that we can look at near the end of this session about opposites, and this fact that, logic, has extremes at any points. And the use of the word extremes is something that is very common in a lot of Plato's dialogues. And so we always need to be able to find the extremes of what we're looking at, whether it's, just a very simple piece of logic or a very broad eternal logic. And so I think there's, maybe the geometry really helps us in understanding the extremes and the relativity of our own perception to those extremes. So very important points that you raise, and certainly this idea of the contrast between extremes and the contradiction of opposites is something that I think is definitely in the realm of intelligence to comprehend, and comprehension of the eternal, as Plato was saying at 28a, is by the account of the reasons why. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah. Is there a difference between the logic that's used by certain philosophers as a tool, but when they're really doing philosophy in the search for wisdom, that they are doing something, doing a process of thinking that is beyond logic, as you would think as logic that's used in science and some other fields of philosophy, but philosophy is at a level that is outside of this kind of logic. And there are some philosophers that claim not to use logic at all, maybe, in their philosophizing.
Oh, I really like that question, JK. It makes me think of that word beauty that Plato used in that review of the logic that we just talked about. And is there a logic to beauty? And that I don't know. I don't think that there is necessarily. And maybe this concept of, while great thinkers like Einstein, for example, define the logic of the physical universe. Like it's been proven time and time again since that Einstein's general theory of relativity is correct.
Hey, James, can I jump in? I don't have the raise hand button. I don't have.
I'll get to you just one second, Greg, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to finish this thought that while Einstein discovered this great piece of logic, maybe it was this idea of beauty, of completeness that he was looking for that drove him to look for that answer. And so it's this idea of completeness, that he was looking for something that was complete. And indeed, during the remainder of his career, he was looking for a unifying theory that he didn't find by the time that he died. So maybe beauty is something that's outside of logic that drives us to discovery. Sorry, I'll go to Greg and then to Alex. Greg?
Sorry that I don't have the raise hand button for whatever reason. So
we'll figure that one out.
As I reading all this material and think about it, and being science in my career myself, using a lot of these kind of scientific logic to do things, and I come to kind of understanding logic as a whole comes back a little bit of Heraclitus, kind of starting with the hint of logic. He used logos. And to me, the logos really is, in his sense, he seems to divide into so many things in the ancient Greeks. They always said this, the visible world and the invisible world. And there the logos to him seems to be, there is order, the logical order of the physical world itself. And then there is an order of the logic in human mind. So it is the match of the two that allow us to get understanding of it. So in the sense that the universe by itself is logical. And it's up to us to find the logic of a human language per se, to understand it. So there is a linguistic logic, and there is a numerical logic, mathematical logic, and there's a geometrical logic, and there's a physical logic. To fit a square, a screw to a nut, it is logic, because the screw can only fit the nuts. That's a physical logic. And you have a geometrical logic that certain square can only be fit in for a certain number of triangles. And so it's numerical. So I think that a human are limited by our intelligence, even though we have. But over time, it's amazing that we're able to devise there's a linguistic logic, the numerical logic, the geometrical logic, and so on. And all together come together, we're able to comprehend this logic of the universe. But that's my view.
Thank you. And certainly, when you talk about words, math, and geometry, in my mind, they're all boiling down to symbols at the end of the day, whether we use letters or whether we use numbers or whether we use pictures as we do with geometry. There's all this symbology, and the symbology has particular meaning. And so it doesn't matter how we render the symbology, it's all leading to some sense of meaning. You talked about the visible and the invisible. Certainly the invisible, I'm not sure if there's a beginning or an end to the invisible, we wouldn't know that. But this idea of the invisible maybe as being kind of potential. So everything that's visible contains a logic, but maybe the invisible is the potential of what we can make with that logic, the meaning that we can make with that logic. I've got Alex, but I just wanted to make one point before Alex and then JK. That we talked earlier about the uncertainty principle. I should maybe mention Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which I would love to learn more about. If anyone here knows anything in particular about Gödel's incompleteness theorems, I just thought that was an interesting point to bring out about uncertainty in the universe, is that there is this idea of incompleteness. And Gödel's logic, I think Gödel was a mathematician, and he used a diagonal argument to prove that logic is theoretically incomplete. That's my understanding of his incompleteness theorems, and so that's an interesting aspect of the universe that was defined, probably about 2,300 years after Plato wrote the Timaeus. So I'll move with that to Alex and then to JK. Alex?
Yeah, thanks, James. Just to expand a little bit, I think, on what you were saying last about incompleteness. And I guess I want to bring in, so in addition to logic, maybe another kind of related topic, which would be ontology, right? So if logic is how we think, ontology is, well, what is the nature of things? What is being like? And I think that might explain maybe some of these differences because, as you've been pointing out, today and throughout, for the Greeks, the world is a kind of unity. Everything hangs together. And I think in many ways, we may be living with in a way, the opposite ontology. Our understanding of the world seems to be very much, fragmentation, uncertainty, incompleteness. So I was thinking, as people have been talking about, when the incommensurables were discovered back in ancient Greece, I think there's sort of a legend that the one who discovered them was kind of ostracized or banished, and somebody probably knows more about this than me. But that's an interesting indication, like somebody discovers this kind of irrational part of the universe and they're just not accepted. And I think today we may in a way be in the opposite situation. If somebody tries to assert there is a unity, everything makes sense, things are rational, in a way that's the person that gets ostracized, because pretty much wherever you turn you see, like, you were saying modern mathematics and logic, there is this, ideas of incompleteness or inconsistency of logical theories. And you turn to philosophy, you're going to find, especially in the continental European philosophy, all this talk of irrationality, of, things not making sense, of the lack of sense, paradox. And that seems to be kind of the order of the day, and so it's an interesting contrast. I'm not really sure where we go from here.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I think that's reflected in our logic, right? So the logic that we use often is like a logic of paradox, or it's a logic of inconsistency, or, any theory goes. There are so many different theories. And so it's an interesting place to be living in many ways, actually. Just to say a last thing, I think this may be similar to the time when Plato was writing. Because when Plato and Socrates actually came about, there were all these sophists around, and there was a lot of doubt about, unity and about the world hanging together. And the sophists were, this figure of sort of, man is the measure of all things, and relativism and incommensurability and all of these ideas. So, yeah, so it's that contrast between the Greeks and us, I think, is important.
Well, thank you, and certainly you raise a very interesting question about our state of knowledge, or our state of understanding of knowledge at the present time, which I think is critical. I mean, we've got immense technological power, and we're about to develop quantum computing technology, which is just shockingly immense. It's a topic that I have followed quite a lot, particularly because of its geometry. If you look at the block sphere diagram of a qubit, you will see geometry in there. It's fundamentally geometric, and that's, to me, a very important symbolic connection to Plato. But I find again that that logic at 28a, this idea that there's these two distinctions, the eternal and the becoming, the eternal is and the state of becoming. And I think what Plato's saying here is that both of those are in us. And I find that a very empowering idea, that we have both that connection to the eternal is and to this constant dynamic state of becoming. And I think, what a beautiful and logical way to construct the universe. That's why I love this. That's why I love Plato, and I love this philosophy and this discussion. I think it's so great. I'm learning so much from what everybody is saying, and so you said it very well, Alex. Thank you. And we'll go to JK.
Yeah, the interesting issue for our modern time is really a distinction between the sciences that are, dominating with logic, with mathematics, and proofs and so forth, and that and the attitude that you don't need philosophy, and so philosophy is really losing its importance. And so, is it is philosophy that much different from science? Or is it does science already include a kind of philosophy, the philosophy of science, that it could understand everything that is to know about our existence? That is the question, actually.
I like to kind of echo what JK said. Yes, it's so true what you say. I've been a scientist and I see so many scientists that have no clue about where our science came from in the first place. And very few really have read anything of the ancient great philosophers like Plato, and so all they read is maybe some interpretation, a very short summary of a university course. Myself included, until like 20 years ago, I didn't really have any idea that where science come from. And only when I dive into did I realize there's realms of this knowledge that really is not only funding the science, but really is the fundamental understanding about a good scientist. So I would say that today there are a lot of people claim that they are scientists. They are in spirit. They are not. They're not the kind of scientists that are in the spirit of what Plato and Aristotle was talking about. And that's a kind of one of kind of insight that I kind of come to understand by going through this journey myself.
Thank you, Greg. I mean, that's a powerful account of your personal journey, and I think it's what JK said about the place of philosophy, I think could never be more important than it is now today, especially with what Plato again says at 28a, is that we can only understand that eternal state that is and never becomes. In other words, the eternal state of the universe with an account of the reasons why. And it's something that has resonated in me since I read the Meno. I haven't talked actually about our next dialogue that I think we'll do in 2 weeks. And I really want to return to the Meno. I've been wanting to return to the Meno for some time. And I think now's a good time to return to it. So I think we'll look at the Meno in 2 weeks, and we'll look particularly at the slave scene that we didn't get to in our very first discussion about the Meno. So this is where Socrates takes the slave who has not been educated and does a little bit of geometry with the slave. It's a very easy geometry involving squares and the Pythagorean theorem. We all know this. So I think we can look at this. It's a relatively short dialogue. I think we'll focus on that and focus on the idea that knowledge is the account of the reasons why, and tie it to what we've been speaking about today in terms of logic and what Plato says at 28a. I think it's so key. And this idea that philosophy, back in Plato's time, was the king of the sciences. You couldn't get better than the philosopher. The philosopher had to be a mathematician, a geometer, an historian, a linguist. A philosopher had to be all of that, and then you could call yourself a philosopher. And now it's turned the other way around. I went to a presentation at the University of Toronto probably 6 years ago, and there was a very famous, what my favorite philosopher, my favorite modern philosopher, Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein, calls him a philosophy poo-pooer. And there he was on stage trashing philosophy. Just, there's no place for philosophy in science, he said. And that shakes me, particularly with the power that we have today. So I think it's very important that we understand that there is a place for philosophy, and especially for asking the reasons why. Because if we don't understand the reasons why, we can understand the how. It's modern science is very good at understanding the how, but maybe not. Maybe needs some work on understanding the reasons why. So I think that would be very important. From here, we've got about a half an hour left, and I wanted to move to this idea of shape, which really is in the first few pages of the second part of the Timaeus that we're looking at. So starting at 48a and going through, somewhere in 52, 53, somewhere in there. And this is maybe a bit of logic. And so, we've got this physical universe, and the physical universe is full of shapes, right? And I just want to ask people how you define shape. It's very how would you define the word shape? So here's Plato describing the construction of the universe. In the first half, he's put the intelligence in the universe. And in the second half, he starts by talking about the universe of physical shape. And so I'm just wondering, do people have an idea of the meaning of shape? What does shape mean to you? Is it something that exists? Or is it something that becomes? Or is it something else? And then also, I just wanted to discuss this idea of space, which he talks about as well. Plato says that space is a fixed state for all that comes to be, because space is indestructible. So just wondering what people think about that in the context of the visible physical universe, this idea of shape and the idea of space. And what do these words, shape and space, mean logically to you? Does anybody have any thoughts based on what you read in the second half of the Timaeus? There's a definition of shape that Plato uses in the Meno. Does anybody recall what it is? For those of us who were with us for our discussion on the Meno?
The limit of a solid?
The limit of, yes, Jose, yes. Shape is the limit of a solid. That's what Plato says in the Meno. And can anybody kind of turn that into a definition, like in terms of what that means? What does that mean, the limit of a solid? So Plato talks a lot in the second half of the Timaeus, I think suspiciously a lot, about the word triangle. He goes out of his way to mention triangle many times in the second half of the Timaeus. So triangle is a shape.
He was considering triangle as the primary shape.
Right. But if you go anywhere in the universe, do you find an object that is triangle itself? Or do you only find objects that are triangular? And here we get about meaning and symbology and words. So does triangle on its own exist anywhere in the universe?
My understanding from reading it, he seems to be implying implicitly that a triangle is the elemental shape of the matter. So he has 4 elements. The 4 elements break into infinite small parts. And then the infinite small parts, the shape of which is a triangle, my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
So no matter how you make other things through the becoming of being, that at the end of the day, that the infinite element of material is a triangle.
Mm-hmm. That to me is what he's saying in the second half of the Timaeus. Certainly that which becomes, that part of the universe that becomes, is based on triangles.
And I find it's fascinating. I mean, may I elaborate a little bit here?
Well, please.
Being a materials scientist, I find it particularly fascinating that at that stage, I could say that literally is the foundation of material science, because the way that Plato put these four elements as the eternal one, from the almost the same time as the God itself, it really strikes me that they think the world as things very elemental, the four elements. Now gradually the search for the more elemental thing that break down till what we have is the periodic table made of some 100 elements and still elemental. So material science today is still in a way elemental, thinking of the periodic table, the gold, the silver, the hydrogen, and the makeup of these elements made of this. But the train of thoughts, the paradigm was set at the time. I find it fascinating. And secondly, I think that by doing so, I'm also fascinated to see the set of vocabularies that he used to describe this materials world. That is the foundational set of vocabulary we still use in material science. Division, composition, continuity, and all that. And then also another thing I find is that this is called the motion is come from non-homogeneity, non-uniformity, and which really implies some seed for the later on the precipitation of the second law of thermodynamics. The chaos, the direction of motion, like it's come from the uniformity. The end is always uniform, and anything non-uniform will create motion. And that's basically one of the conclusions of the second law. I found that's very, very fascinating. Anyway, that's a few kind of thoughts that come from being a material science myself.
Well, thank you for sharing that knowledge and that experience. And certainly, I mean, you bring the second law of thermodynamics, which is a key law to understanding time. I mean, time only works in one direction, and it can never violate the second law of thermodynamics, which, if I'm summarizing it correctly, is just basically saying that everything physical comes to a state of equilibrium in entropy, and reaches that point of uniformity that you mentioned. And that's so key to understanding the physical universe that Plato is describing the construction of in the second half of the Timaeus, and to understanding the nature of time. And Jane has referred to the nature of time a few times in this discussion. And I think it's important to keep that idea in mind in terms of the nature of time as being this eternal moving image, moving in accordance to number. And certainly in the physics, the geometry, the mathematics, everything does seem to move according to number. And so a very important concept there that we can't forget. And I think, again, this idea of shape, this world of shapes that we live in, these shapes always coming and going, and, anything physical is subject to this idea of entropy. It will all reach a state of entropy, which is this state of uniformity at the end. But we have this state of becoming, which is the dynamic state where we can change the shapes. And I think that's really kind of an empowering thing as beings such as we are, that we have this power, this dynamic power in the present to change the shapes around us. Whether we can change a shape individually is sometimes subject to physical limitations. Like I might be very strong, but I'm not strong enough that I can knock down a whole building. Superman can do that, but or Wonder Woman can do that, but I can't do that. But collectively, we have shaped an entire planet. Humans collectively have, shaped the entire landscape of the earth. We've built cities. We have changed the courses of rivers, and we've caused all sorts of changes to the shapes of this planet around us. And so I think this idea of shape that Plato brings forward in the second half of the Timaeus is very important to understanding our position and the position of the intelligent beings within this universe, and the power that we have to shape it. So a very important question. And maybe just, maybe this, Eva, as we're getting about 20 minutes to closing, this would be a good time to put that that second slide on the screen. And so this is going back to a point that was made in the first half at 31C to 32A, and I have paraphrased here my understanding of those sections, and I've used an axiom from Euclid. So to paraphrase the words that Plato said, using the words of Euclid, things that are like one thing are like each other. And then to tie it to what Plato says in the second half of the Timaeus at 50D, we need to keep in mind three types of things: that which comes to be, that in which it comes to be, and that after which the thing coming to be is modeled, and which is the source of its coming to be. And so here we're talking about the cause of coming to be. And so in the first part of the Timaeus, we looked at the idea of same, different, and being. We looked at that in the context of the quote at 35A to B, in which Plato writes, the components from which he, the maker or the framer or the demiurge, made the soul, and the way in which he made it were as follows. In between the being, that is indivisible and always changeless, and the one that is divisible and comes to be in the corporeal realm, he mixed a third intermediate form of being derived from the other two. Similarly, he made a mixture of the same and then one of the different, in between their indivisible and their corporeal divisible counterparts. And he took the three mixtures and mixed them together to make a uniform mixture, forcing the different, which was hard to mix, into conformity with the same. Now that he had, when he had mixed these two together with being, and from the three had made a single mixture, he redivided the whole mixture into as many parts as his task required. Each part containing a mixture of the same, the different, and the being. And then he talked about some proportions in the remainder of that quote. So I just thought I would remind that's where we started 2 weeks ago, was with that quote from 35A to 35B. And I think Jane picked up on that in our last discussion in trying to place the soul in this context of same, different, and being. And so here I thought it would be interesting to just take a look at this idea of what Plato was talking in the first half and to tie it to the second half. And Eva, if you could just scroll down just one line on this slide. Yeah, that's good. That's good. So at the beginning, Plato says that there could be two things. And so I just put on this slide two things, two lines. One, so for the benefit of our viewers not seeing the screen, so there are just two lines in this image. One is vertical and one is horizontal, and they're separated by space. And so it's kind of the space makes them two separate things. So one's a vertical line and the other's a horizontal line. And so you have two things, two separate things, separated by space. And then this idea that Plato talked about in the first half of bonding them together. And so in the second image on the screen here, all I've done is I've just moved the two lines together. So we still have a vertical line and we still have a horizontal line, but they're now joined. There's no space between them. So we've removed the space. And so we put this bond, and I've just drawn the bond with a red dot. And, as I look at this image, I wonder, is this now one thing? So we have a vertical line joined with a horizontal line. Does it form one consistent unit? Or is it actually three things in the sense that we've got a vertical line, we've got a horizontal line going off to the right, and a horizontal line going off to the left. So we've kind of got three different directions here. So we've got a vertical direction, a right direction, and a left direction. And all we've done is just move them together. We've got rid of the space, and we've joined them with this red dot.
My understanding on the two figure from what I read from Timaeus, it seems that Plato was meant that bound to be the space. Therefore, if that were the space, then the two things on the left hand and on the right hand are the two different kind of setting. They are both bounded space. The first one is bounded space with a gap between the two things.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, they're bounded by the space without a gap. But they are now two different things. So the space is the bound. That's my understanding.
Yeah, you raise a good point. And certainly Plato makes this comment about space being that which fixes things. Space is, you can never divide space. So space, as you're saying, is kind of part of that bond. And then Eva, maybe if you can just scroll down to the bottom half of this slide. And in the bottom half, I've drawn a triangle. So all I've done, and this is really just to get us to where Plato was talking about triangles all through the second half. So if you can just scroll down to the bottom of the triangle there. That's good. And let's get those two quotes in there as well, Eva, if you can scroll down a bit more. Perfect. So here we've still got the same vertical line joined to the horizontal line with that same red dot as the bond that joins them. And all I've done here is I've added the hypotenuse. So I've made it into a triangle. So, and then I've just reminded everybody, and I think, we all learn, I can't remember at what point in school I learned, I think it was probably in elementary school, the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So I've just labeled the vertical line, I've labeled A, the horizontal line, in each half of the horizontal line, I've labeled B, and the hypotenuse is C. And so we have a triangle. Now, I've just put a few quotes here from the second half of the Timaeus. The first is at 53d. Now, everything that has bodily form also has depth. Depth, moreover, is of necessity comprehended within surface. And maybe, Greg, here we can think of surface as being space. And any surface bounded by straight lines is composed of triangles. Every triangle, moreover, derives from two triangles, each of which has one right angle and two acute angles. And so this is what Plato says at 53d. And we can see in this diagram what he's talking about. The right angle is where A joins B. It joins B on the right-hand side. It joins B on the left-hand side. So there's a right angle. Right angle is 90 degrees. Pi over 2, 90 degrees. And then the second quote that I thought was relevant to this is at 62d to 63a, and I'll just read it out. For given that the whole heaven is spherical, all the points that are situated as extremes at an equal distance from the center must, by their nature, be extremes of just the same sort. And we must take it that the center, being equidistant from the extremes, is situated at the point that is the opposite to all extremes. So here we get this idea of opposites. If further there is something solid and evenly balanced at the center of the universe, it could not move to any of the extreme points because these are all alike in all directions. And so I just wanted to, maybe in the time that remains, ask everyone here, because again, I tend to think in pictures, and pictures are just symbols like words and numbers. So when I'm looking at this picture, I'm trying to think of the same, the different, and being. And I'm just wondering if you were to place in this little geometric triangle here, if you were to indicate which is the same, which is the different, and which is being, I'm wondering which of these letters you would apply to each. So again, we've got, for our listeners who can't see this, we've got a triangle. We've got the base of the triangle, each half of the base labeled B. We've got the leg or the height of the triangle labeled A. And we've got the hypotenuses labeled C. So we've got a right angle triangle pointing to the right, and we've got a right angle triangle pointing to the left, and they're joined at the middle by this red dot. And so if you were thinking of the same, the different, and being, which Plato talks at 35a to 35b as this mixture, like this insanely difficult mixture it is to create, to bond together the same and different, and to put it together in being, and to kind of create this dynamic universe in the process. where would you say in this diagram, does anybody see the same? Does anybody see the different? And does anybody see being? Any thoughts on that? Jane, I know you asked about, I think you raised this point in our last discussion 2 weeks ago. I thought it was very important, and it just, what you said made me draw this. I think there's a lot of relevance to what you asked. And I'm just wondering if anybody sees that. Any thoughts? Joel?
As I view this, I would see A as being same. I would see B and C as being different but equivalent. That makes any sense?
Okay.
And where you have a red dot, I would visualize a red dot at the other end of that line as well on A,
Mm-hmm.
and consider both of those red dots as being.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't know why I say that, but
Mhm.
that's just how it strikes me.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So Joel has referred to A, which is the vertical line that divides this triangle into two, as the line that he would call the same. And he's pointed to the base of the triangle, which is labeled B on either side of A, as the, you were saying that was the different, I think, Joel?
I would say different but equivalent.
But equivalent, yes. Different but equivalent. And then being, you were saying were you saying it's bounded by B and C? So
No,
B being base and C being the hypotenuse?
No, I would say being would be bounded by B on its lower base, and bounded by C, A, and C on its upper extremity.
Okay.
I would consider both of those points being,
Right.
which are equivalent, or which are ends of the same.
Right.
And does that make any sense at all? I don't know.
You know, I like your logical approach. I think it's making sense. Jane, what are your thoughts on this, Jane?
Okay, first of all, I wanted to I don't know if it's like a question or a comment, but in my, like, in the dialogue that I was reading, instead of being, they had the word essence. So there's the same, the other, and the essence. So I don't know, this always kind of gets me with all of the dialogue. So if you read different translations, you sort of get a different understanding from each. And so for me, like, being is totally different. For me, being is what creates the same, the other, and the essence. That's just a quick note. And regarding the triangle, I'm not sure if I would be sure which one is the same and which one is the other. It's either the A or the B for me. I'll see as being the essence that joins it to create like one unity, because when you draw them onto the drawing, you sort of get the unity, that one shape. At least that's the way I saw it. And again, I did like geometry back in school. I was good at it at the time, but I totally forgot most of the basics. So yeah, but yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I think we all see geometry through our daily existence in shape, right? And everywhere we go, there's shape. And so geometry is inescapable, I think, for all of us. And so it doesn't. We're kind of all experts in a way that we're dealing with, daily existence. And so, yeah, I think that's a key point. I tend to see the hypotenuse kind of in the way that you're describing it, Jane, as kind of the bounds of this essence or being. And thank you for pointing out that difference in the translation of the word being in the version that you're using. So I kind of see C, which is the hypotenuse of the triangles, the right angle triangles, being kind of the boundary of being. And Greg, maybe to answer your point about space earlier, I see the space that's comprised within the triangle that's bounded by B at the base and C in the hypotenuse. I see that as as what's contained within this logical structure. I have JK. JK, your thoughts?
It's to answer the question of that you're asking. Wouldn't you have to understand how this triangle fits into the sphere, into the circle, and then the extremes would be the the parts inside would be
A squared plus B squared equals C squared, which is more generalized as AN plus A to the N plus B to the N equals C to the N when N is constrained to a limit of 2 or less. And that was proven, first hypothesized by Fermat and then later proven elliptically by Andrew Wiles. So that's a generalized format of it. But I would put out the question, and we can maybe talk about this next time when we come back to the Meno, is where would the soul fit into this? Or does the soul, does anybody see the soul here? And unfortunately, we won't have time to get into that question, but I would just ask people to think about that. If you were to draw the soul, if you were to impose the soul perhaps on this, where would you put the soul? How would you apply the soul to the same, to the different, and to being? So that's a thought that we can ponder on and think about and maybe probe a little bit further as we consider the theme of the soul, which is all through Plato's dialogues, and as we look at the Meno next time. As I said, I think just focusing on the slave scene and then towards the end where Plato says that knowledge is recollection, but it's also the account of the reasons why, which I think is very, very much tied to the whole theme of the Timaeus. So I think on that point, I just, we're sort of at the end of our time, and I just wanted to thank everyone for being part of this discussion. I think we've had a great discussion today. So many good points brought out. I know I've learned from it, and I hope everyone has learned from each other, which again is, I think is the whole point of Plato, is that we, in the course of our dialogue, we learn things that we didn't know before. We continue to derive knowledge. We continue to integrate knowledge. And as Socrates says at the end of Meno, never cease to ask why and never cease to seek and to learn. So I think that's the importance of what we're doing here together in dialogue, and certainly look forward to meeting everybody again in 2 weeks and to looking at the Meno again. So thank you all for being here with us today, and it's been a great day, and looking forward to our next discussion in 2 weeks.
Thank you for joining today's discussion, friends. This was Plato's Pod with James Myers. It's always exciting to hear your comments and curiosity, and especially James, thanks for leaving us with the question of where does the soul fit? That would be a challenge. I am Eva Ellis. It was my honor to coordinate this episode of Plato's Pod today. See you at another episode. Bye.